You fool! Warren is dead.
Into the Gaping Maw of Cecelia Davenport by Ian Gordon. Part 1. Buckingham Street. There was nothing particularly remarkable about that row of houses, except perhaps for where they stood, the quiet, half-forgotten Manchester suburb of Lowther. When it rains in the town, the streets flood. When the wind comes, it doesn't just blow, it screams through the terraces like a jet breaking the sound barrier. When it snows, the thaw turns to a thick, grey soup that makes walking an ordeal. And when, on those rare occasions, the sun decides to show its face, it only manages to light the upper floors of the tenement blocks that hem the town in from the south, leaving Lowther itself in a kind of permanent, moss-coloured twilight. No, there was nothing particularly remarkable about that row of houses, except for where they stood and the woman who lived at number 44. But we'll learn about her later. Under certain conditions, viewed from the other side of the canal, lit by the moon, Buckingham Street looked almost pretty. The terraces rose in a neat brick line, front doors facing a narrow strip of grass that ran down the middle. At the far end of the grass, bent a little from one too many winters, stood a metal sign that read, in pebbled black letters, "No ball games." The sign was not obeyed. On most afternoons, and even on cold Sundays like this one, the grass belonged to the children. They scuffed it up into mud, wore paths through it, shouted themselves hoarse over rules that changed every 5 minutes, and paid the sign about as much attention as the pigeons did. Behind the upstairs window of number 22, a girl stood watching. Betsy Carr pressed her forehead to the cold glass and tried to ignore the sound of her dad's radio downstairs. Tinny music, a presenter talking about closures on a road she'd never heard of. Her focus was the kids outside, the thump of a ball, a boy's voice yelling, "Pass it!" A girl laughing, someone calling offside with great authority. The Carrs, Betsy and her dad Steve, had been on Buckingham a few weeks now, long enough for the novelty of a new house to fade, long enough for the smell of the carpets to disappear, but not quite long enough for Betsy to feel that any of it belonged to her. "Bets!" Steve's voice floated up the stairs, marked by a tired brightness. "You gonna come and give us a hand or what?" She dragged herself from the window and made her way downstairs. Her dad was in the front room, kneeling on a dust sheet with a paintbrush in his hand, making slow work of the skirting board. The house reeked of gloss and damp plaster. "You said I could go out," Betsy said. "Remember?" Steve sat back on his heels and looked at her. 9 years old, wild golden hair that resisted the brush, knees grubby from kneeling on the windowsill to see outside. She had her mum's eyes, big and blue, which was both a comfort and a problem. "You met any of them yet?" he asked, nodding towards the window. "Them lot outside?" "Yeah," she said. "There's Alan, never shuts up. Alice, she's all right. Rose is scared of worms. Brandon, he's the weird one." "Go on then," Steve said, smiling. "If you're going, go, but stay where I can see you. Don't be wandering off." Betsy nodded affirmatively. "Good, and if it gets dark, you're in, yeah?" "Okay," she said. She grabbed her coat from the peg in the hallway, wrestled her arms into it, and let herself out. The cold Sunday air met her with that humid Lowther heaviness, the stench of wet brick and the canal. Her breath came out in little puffs as she crossed the flagstones to the grass. Alan spotted her first. Of course he did. "Aye," he shouted, as if she lived at the far end of the street instead of directly opposite. "You playing or what?" Alice waved, dark cheeks pink from the cold, hair escaping its bobble. Rose stood slightly back from the others, clutching her sleeves over her hands, watching the ball like it might explode. "Yeah, okay," Betsy said. "Bran!" Alan barked instantly, directing the boy like a drill sergeant. "Get in goal, man." Brandon, a tall but timid character, groaned and trudged between two jumpers that had been flung down to mark the posts. The game resumed in that chaotic way children's games do. For a while, the cold was forgotten. Betsy ran until her chest ached, rainbow welly boots slapping wet grass. She fluffed an easy shot, and Alan called her useless in a way that somehow didn't really sting. Rose, more a shrinking violet, squealed every time the ball came near her ankles, though managed, through sheer terror, to block 2 attempts on goal. The terraces watched in silence. 22 with its flaking paint and newly scrubbed windows, 20 with its net curtains yellowed by cigarettes, and 44 right across from the cars, its small front garden enclosed by a low fence and a row of clipped shrubs like dutiful beefeaters. 44 was different. No discarded toys, no bikes leaning at drunken angles, no worn path from gate to door. The grass was a short, uniform green. The flower beds were stripped bare for winter, turned and tidy. The keeper of the yard took meticulous care. But the kids didn't notice any of that. Gardens were for grown-ups to worry about. It happened on a miss kick. Alan went for a heroic volley, misjudged it completely, and caught the ball with the side of his shoe. It sailed off at an angle, climbed gracefully over the little fence, and dropped onto the immaculate lawn of 44. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The ball just sat there. "Nice one," Alice said. "It were the wind," Alan protested, blushing. "I'll get it." The red-headed boy was already heading for the fence. He swung a leg over, then the other, before dropping lightly onto the forbidden grass. "Go on, then," Alice encouraged softly. "Hurry up." Alan crept forward with exaggerated stealth, milking it for all it was worth. He bent, grabbed the ball, straightened up, and held it aloft like a trophy. And that was when they heard it. At first, Betsy thought it was a dog, a big one, a low, guttural sound emerging from the pristine facade of 44. It rolled, deep and wet, like something clearing its throat. Alan froze. The ball slipped from his hands and thudded back onto the grass. Alice shook her head without taking her eyes off the house. The curtains were drawn. No light showed around their edges. The growling rose again. It seemed to move from one side of the house to the other, as if pacing back and forth. "Come on, Al," Brandon pleaded. "Just leave it. We'll play something else." The idea of the ball staying there, abandoned on that manicured grass, felt somehow worse than the idea of a dog. Alan took a careful step forward, hauled the ball up under one arm, and in the same movement turned and lobbed it back over the fence. Betsy flinched as it came towards her, hands up. The ball bounced off the no-ball game signpost and rolled to a stop next to Alice's foot. "Told you," Alan said, though his voice was thin now. "No problem." He vaulted the fence, landing less elegantly than before. Rose grabbed his sleeve and yanked him away from the garden. The growling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of passing traffic on a street out of sight, somewhere beyond the end of Buckingham. "Let's play at the other end," Alice said, a little too briskly. "By the bin sheds." "I don't know," Betsy said, scanning the purple sky above. "I need to go in soon." "Yeah," Alan managed, huffing. "Me too. Let's play again tomorrow, yeah?" And it was with eager steps that each of the 5 children returned to their respective homes. Back at 22, Steve served up a pan of something that involved pasta and a jar of sauce. Proper grub, he called it. Betsy proceeded to tell him, in the half-distracted way of children, about goals scored and arguments over throw-ins. She didn't mention the garden or the growling. After tea, Steve washed up, while Betsy absently watched the end of a horror film. A weird one, she thought, involving a deranged madman stalking a cinema. She found herself glancing through the open curtains from time to time, her thoughts a mixture of the horror blaring from the TV screen and the growling noises she'd heard outside 44. It was blacker than black out there. The street lamp in front of the house was utterly dead. Anyone could be out there. Anyone or anything. Neither idea appealed to her overactive imagination. Later, when Betsy was in bed and the house had shrunk to its nighttime creaks and sighs, Steve decided he'd earned a smoke. He threw his coat on over his t-shirt, shoved his feet into his boots without lacing them, and stepped out of the front door with a familiar blend of relief and guilt. The cold bit harder now. His breath rose in small, crooked clouds. He cupped his hands around the cigarette as he lit it, the flame briefly illuminating his face and the chipped paint of the front step. He took a drag, exhaled, and listened. The distant hum of the ring road, a dog barking 2 streets over, a burst of laughter from an upstairs window somewhere. He wasn't a fan of Buckingham Street, not a huge supporter of Lowther in general, but there they were, father and daughter, happy together in spite of the challenges life had thrown at them. The coffers were light, work inconsistent, but they were managing, surviving. Bets was a tough little egg. She had to be, really. What choice did she have? What choice did either of them have? Cecelia had passed, but no, he wasn't going to dwell on that. He finished the cigarette, shivering, and cast a cynical eye at the lifeless street lamp. Need to get that sorted, he said under his breath, as if someone from the council might be listening. He turned and went back inside. Behind him, the street resumed its silent watch. The empty grass lay in its pocket of darkness, the no-ball game sign a pale smudge. Across the way, in one of the quiet, gloom-shrouded houses, a curtain shifted and fell still again, as if something had just moved back from the window. Part 2. You Are What You Eat. Betsy woke to the sound of a bin lorry. It crashed down the back of Buckingham Street like some great metal beast, brakes squealing, chains rattling. "Bets!" Steve's voice came from the bottom of the stairs. "Are you up? Come on, you don't want to be late." She dressed quickly and glanced out of the window. The street was in its morning mood. Curtains half drawn, a man in a high-vis vest circling the broken street lamp, a woman in slippers lighting a cigarette. The grass was filmed with frost, the no-ball game sign obscured by it. Number 44 looked the same as ever, silent, artificially neat. Downstairs, the house reeked of burnt toast and stale coffee. Steve hovered between the tiny kitchen and the hallway, doing far too many things at once. "There she is," he said. "Get some toast down you. Butter's on the table. Don't be shy with it." The drone of the little radio filled the kitchen. Traffic, weather, the word Lowther attached to ongoing struggles. "You sleep all right?" Steve asked. "Yeah. Not cold? We can put the heating on for half an hour tonight if you want. Live like kings?" "It's fine," she said, shaking her head. Her hair was like a bird's nest. Soon, they were at the door. "Do you want me to walk you? Are you all right from the corner?" he asked. "I'm all right. Alice and them go the same way." "Fair enough. You see 'em, stick with 'em. Safety in numbers and all that." As if on cue, Alan and Brandon appeared, wrestling a school bag. Alice followed at a sensible pace. Rose brought up the rear, scarf over her face. "There you are," Steve said. "Off you go. Have a good one, yeah?" "I'll try," she said, meekly. Her dad smiled reassuringly. Betsy met her friends at the end of the street by the corner shop. The sky overhead was overcast, hundreds of black clouds threatening to do their worst. "All right, new girl," Alan said, scanning her from head to toe. The bird's nest didn't go unnoticed. "What happened to you? Sleep in a cupboard last night?" Betsy smirked, shaking her head playfully. Alice and Rose rolled their eyes, while Brandon, timid as ever, blushed as though the joke had been on him. They turned off Buckingham onto Market Street, a busy thoroughfare. Cars hissed by. As they went, listening to Alan's near-continuous commentary, Betsy caught the occasional glimpse of the old canal, which ran parallel with the road. The water was partially frozen, with long black cracks crisscrossing the ice. Betsy thought of the dark liquid underneath and shivered involuntarily. Lowther Primary School loomed ahead, a red-brick, large-windowed affair at the junction of Market Street and Regent Street. Inside, Miss Carter's classroom was bright and buzzing. Betsy's place was between Alice and Rose, their names written on trays in neat teacher print. This was only her second week, but Miss Carter had been kind, and the kids, warm if a bit silly, especially in the case of Alan Waring, had taken her in without fuss. To her surprise, she'd settled quickly, and found she rather liked the way Miss Carter did things. The young teacher radiated positivity. It was in her broad, toothy smile and her huge hazel eyes. Just before morning break, the classroom door opened. Mr. Lewis, the head, entered. Betsy saw his moustache appear before the man himself. "Sorry, Miss Carter, can I have a word?" The gaunt man clasped his hands together, crow's feet enhanced as he seemingly winced, an expression he struggled to mask. "Now, I don't want anyone to worry," he began, "but there's a little boy, someone who lives not too far from here, who hasn't been home since yesterday. His mum and dad are very worried. The police are looking for him, and lots of grown-ups are helping." "A boy from here?" one of the kids asked. "No, he goes to a different school, but he lives in Lowther. So, we're going to be extra careful." The headmaster listed the rules. No leaving the playground, walking straight home, telling a grown-up if anything felt wrong. His smile never quite reached those wrinkled eyes. Again, Betsy's thoughts turned to dark water, tidy gardens, low growling. When Mr. Lewis left, Miss Carter said, "You're safe here. School is safe. Home is safe. We just have to be wary, okay? Vigilant. Do you remember that word?" A round-faced child said, "If we're safe, why are the police looking for him?" Miss Carter smiled tightly and announced break. On the playground, the mood was different. Groups of kids huddled together, whispering conspiratorially. "He got kidnapped," a girl said. "By a man in a van." "A woman in a van," someone else said. "Women kidnap people too." "Maybe he just ran away," Alice proffered, her bottom lip trembling. "Why would he?" Rose put in. "I heard Raffy Jones saying his house is well nice. His mum and dad are loaded." "What's that got to do with it?" a grey-faced boy said, rocking back and forth on his heels. "What if he didn't run away?" Betsy said quietly, her dramatic tone drawing the attention of everybody present. "What if something happened?" Brandon joined them then, his rosy cheeks glowing. "You heard of the bag lady?" he said, directing the question at Betsy. Alice groaned. "Not that again." "She's real," the tall boy insisted. "My cousin saw her outside the office. She had like 10 bags, big uns. One of them was moving." "Yeah, right," Alice said, shoving him. "He said there was something inside trying to get out," Brandon went on, his eyes wide with the wonder of the thing. "It was an arm, a kid's arm, sticking out the top." "That's just stupid," Betsy said, but she didn't sound convinced. No one would walk around with an arm in a bag. They'd get arrested. "Not if they're invisible," Brandon said, the stern expression he wore fixed and firm. "How's an arm invisible?" Alice demanded. "Not the arm, the bag lady. My cousin says she's a ghost, a witch or something, lives near us." "Where near us?" Betsy asked, before she could stop herself. "Dunno," Brandon said, shrugging his lanky shoulders. "Near the canal, behind the shops, near you probably." "Bran," Alice said, grabbing a sizable portion of his bubble coat. "You're an idiot." "I'm telling you," he went on, not so timidly. "There's a girl in year 6 says she saw her too, picking stuff up, out the bins, out the backs of houses. My nan says she's always picking stuff up. But my cousin says it's not just rubbish. Dead things too, cats, pigeons, bags them up, keeps them." "That's disgusting," Rose blurted, which suggested she believed at least some of it. Betsy looked past them, to the railings and the road beyond. People waited at a bus stop. A man pushed a pram. At the back of the houses there, the canal. Somewhere further along, Buckingham Street. A picture of the bag lady took shape in Betsy's mind. That of a short, hunched figure, face hidden, arms bristling with clinking plastic. Alan, full of his usual enthusiasm, jogged over. "What are we on about?" he demanded, puffing his chest out cockily. "The bag lady," Brandon said. The red-headed boy brightened. "Oh, yeah, I've seen her, loads. Hangs around the alley near me nan's. Stinks like the tip. Whenever you walk past, she goes." He hunched his shoulders and snorted horribly. Rose giggled nervously. Betsy squirmed. "What if," Brandon resumed, "she's got something to do with that kid?" "Don't," Rose said. "I'm just saying," he went on. "My dad says there's a nutter on every street. They wander round, do weird things." "There are loads of old ladies with bags," Alice said. Alan grinned at Betsy. "Probably hiding in your wardrobe, new girl." Something cold settled in Betsy's chest. She'd be damned if she could identify it. But it was there, whatever it was. "Don't wind her up," Alice ordered. "You know you're talking shit." Just then, Miss Carter blew the whistle. Break was over. The rest of the day crawled by. Miss Carter read a story about a boy and a dog, a fearful boy and a valiant dog, a tale that seemed especially tame after Betsy's viewing of Popcorn the previous evening. Sums followed, dull, monotonous mathematics. By home time, Betsy was more than ready to escape. She said goodbye to Alice and Rose. Alan and Brandon had already sprinted off. The walk home was shorter. It always was somehow. She noticed houses she'd overlooked before, a bungalow with a concrete lion, a semi with Christmas lights dancing to an unheard beat. The odd face peered at her emptily, residents caught in the act of closing curtains or returning from work. As Betsy reached Buckingham Street, the grey clouds finally commenced to offer a fine drizzle. It seemed quieter than usual, empty of people and static under the rain. She couldn't help but glance in the direction of 44, but the stillness ruled there too. Neater than ever, she thought. No stray bags adorning the flawless turf. Stepping into 22, she dropped her bag by the door. "Good timing," Steve called. "Tea's nearly ready." Whoa, another pan of pasta, another jar of sauce. "Come on," he said. "Eat up." Betsy sat down and teased a piece of pasta with a fork. "How was school?" Steve asked. "All right. Good." For a moment or two, the only sound was forks scraping at plates. "There's a boy," Betsy said at last. "Gone missing. Not at our school, somewhere else in Lowther." Steve's smile faded. "Yeah, I heard something about that on the radio. Don't you worry, though. That's grown-up stuff. The police are on it." "He's a kid," Betsy said, eyeing her dad seriously. "So it's kid stuff, too." "Listen," Steve said. "Most of the time when kids go missing, they've gone to their mates without telling anyone, or they're sulking in a shed. He'll probably be back home before tomorrow." Steve watched her push past her around. He couldn't read the expression on her face. "You need to eat something," he said. "You're skin and bone." "I'm not hungry." "Tough," he said gently. Come on, just a couple more mouthfuls. It's not that bad, is it? Smiling feebly, she forced another forkful into her mouth. Crikey, it was bland. Well, you know what they say, Steve went on. You are what you eat. Carry on like this and you'll turn into a piece of dry toast. She thought of the missing boy, of arms in bags. I don't want to turn into anything, she muttered. Too late, Steve said. You already turned into my daughter. No returns policy on that, I'm afraid. He winked. She rolled her eyes and tried another forkful. After tea, Steve washed up while Betsy sat in the front room, staring at the TV without really seeing it. No film tonight, just one of those generic game shows involving a couple of families and an embarrassingly low jackpot. Every so often, her gaze drifted to the open curtains. The window was a square of black glass, a vague reflection of the room. Beyond that, just darkness thick enough to touch. She wondered, not for the first time, what, if anything, was looking back. Part 3. The Old Cinema. It was Tuesday, and Betsy still didn't feel quite right. She did all the usual things, got dressed, ate toast, let her dad fuss with her collar. She walked to school with Alan and the others, listening to him complain about fractions and how unfair it was that you had to learn them, even though nobody he knew had ever used one. At school, Mr. Lewis came round again to say there was still no news about the missing boy, and that they all had to keep being sensible. Betsy half expected him to produce the boy from behind his back, miraculously recovered, just to prove grown-ups were right about everything. By 3 p.m., her head was aching. Too many sums, not enough air. And when the bell finally went, the whole class seemed to exhale simultaneously. Right, Miss Carter said, clapping her hands. Coats on, straight home, please. No detours, no hanging around the shops. She widened her eyes in mock outrage. The school spilled its contents onto the junction of Market Street and Regent Street. Streams of jumpers and backpacks, bright coats against the dull sky. Betsy stuck close to Alice and Rose as they passed through the gates. Straight home, Alice repeated, like an incantation. Straight home, Alan agreed, after we go to the pictures. Betsy frowned. Pictures? Alan jerked his thumb over his shoulder, towards the canal. The old cinema, he said. You been yet? Betsy shook her head. She'd noticed the building, a squat, boarded-up thing standing on the equally derelict-looking Valley Road, but she'd had no desire to go poking about inside. We're not allowed, Rose said immediately. We're not allowed to do anything, Alan barked. Doesn't stop us though, does it? I have to go home, Alice put in, half-heartedly. Let's just have a look, Alan went on. Quick one, 5 minutes. Brandon stepped forward. They say it's haunted, he said, a little too eagerly. Everything's haunted according to you, Alice told him. Betsy hesitated. She thought of her dad saying, straight home. She thought of Popcorn, the film that took place in an abandoned theatre. And she thought of the bag lady, prowling the streets in search of God knows what. Come on, Alan said, grinning like a maniac. In and out. You can't live in Lowther and not see the old cinema. Betsy glanced at Alice. Alice sighed, pulling the bobble from her jet-black hair, a sign of capitulation, if ever there was one. 5 minutes, she huffed. If we get in trouble, it's on you. It's always on me, Alan blurted cheerfully. Come on. The group cut across Market Street and ducked into a side street that took them straight to Valley Road. The air changed as they went, colder, wetter, metallic and stale, like sucking on an old coin. The cinema, a grisly sight indeed, hunched at the end of the road, its rear end overlooking the canal. It must have been grand once. You could see it in the old flourishes, the curved outline of the roof, the ornamental stone around the entrance. Now the doors were sheets of metal, the windows boarded, the weather-beaten lettering little more than a ghostly outline. "My mum used to come here when she was little," Alice said. "Yeah?" Alan mumbled, keenly focused on getting inside. They went round the back, where someone had done the council a favour years before and kicked in a section of plywood. I'm not crawling through there," Rose protested. "I'll go first," Alan said. "Piece of piss." "That's not reassuring," Alice muttered, but the red-headed boy was already down on his hands and knees, wriggling through. Betsy followed, the ground damp through the knees of her tights. She didn't like it, not a bit of it, but she also didn't like the idea of saying no to Alan, of saying no to any of them. It was dark inside, boarded-up windows permitting slivers and strips of daylight here and there. They were in a corridor. A battered fire extinguisher lay on its side, its hose pointing accusingly at the ceiling. The place reeked. "Wow," Brandon whispered, as if the building might be sleeping. "I told you," Alan said. "This way." The boy led them into what had been the foyer. Betsy beheld the big open space, the ticket booth, the ghost of a staircase heading up to a balcony. The carpet under the film of dirt was elaborately patterned, worn flat in wide tracks where feet had once queued for popcorn and other goodies. "This way," Alan said again, and pushed open the double doors that led into the main auditorium. The foul stench intensified. The air had that stale, back-of-your-throat quality indicative of a room shut up for too long. Rows of seats fell away into the gloom, upholstery torn and sagging, stuffing poking out like burst stitches. At the far end, the screen was just a big grey slab, pockmarked and flaking. Betsy's gaze roamed the aisles. In her mind's eye, she saw the ghosts of yesteryear, dozens of people, kids like her, crammed in to watch the latest flick, the latest blockbuster. Decay was mostly a foreign concept to a 9-year-old, but she contemplated it now, surrounded as she was by the decomposition of decades. "Let's have a look round the back," Alan barked eagerly. "I've never seen what's behind the screen." 5 minutes, Alice reminded him, her hands held close to her chest defensively. "Then we go home." Alan nodded, as if what she said was a given. They picked their way down the steps, skirting holes in the floor, and slipped through a side door marked "Staff Only." The corridor behind the screen was narrower, darker. Hardly any light made it beyond. I don't like this," Rose whispered. "You don't like anything," Alan said, mockingly. Turning a corner, they came to a small room. Immediately, they saw the back of the pockmarked screen. But they saw something else, too. For a moment, Betsy thought it was an old coat, a pile of old coats. Then her eyes adjusted. Coats didn't have feet. A number of animals were piled there. A cat, its fur matted and pulled. Something that might once have been a badger. A pigeon or two, wings torn and misshapen. The bodies were ragged, chewed, as if something with very sharp teeth had had its way with them. The kids just stood there, gawping. "Told you it was haunted," Brandon managed at last, swallowing audibly. "Foxes," Alan said quickly. "Foxes do that. Or dogs, wild dogs." "Wild dogs?" Alice said faintly. "Here? Well, what else could it be?" Alan demanded, a little too loudly. Betsy's throat was suddenly dry. The sweet, thick stench was intolerable. "We should go," Rose whispered. Her eyes shone, but she was determined not to cry. "Yeah," Alice agreed. "We've seen enough. Time to go." They backed out of the room, careful not to step on anything. What if What if someone put them there? Brandon said. Like, a collection. Why would anyone collect half-eaten animals? Alice pleaded. Brandon shrugged. I don't know. Ask the bag lady. Don't, Alice said sharply. Alan, for once, let Brandon's comment slide. The boy looked uneasy, shoulders square but eyes flicking down the dark corridor ahead. Come on, he said again, his voice a quiver. Let's get out of here. They shuffled on, back along the staff corridor. As they neared the far end, they heard a sound. It was faint at first, a rustle, a scrape, plastic dragged over concrete. Then a muted, horrible squelching noise like old lip smacking. Alan stopped dead, as did everyone else, slamming into each other like shopping trolleys. What's that? Rose breathed, fingernails meeting teeth. Alan didn't answer. He edged forward, just enough to peer round the corner. Betsy, heart hammering, leaned too. Alice tugged at her sleeve, but she ignored it. At the end of the corridor, standing in the rectangle of light from a door propped open to the outside, was a figure small and hunched. Layers of clothing shrouded the shape, coat over cardigan, over something else, all in shades of grey and brown that seemed to match the colourless walls. Several carrier bags hung from thin wrists, bulging with indeterminate contents. Further bags, black and numerous, were strewn on the floor around the figure's feet. It was bent at the waist, picking things up from the concrete and bagging them. Its movements were slow and methodical. The kids didn't need Brandon to tell them who the figure was. The bag lady, Betsy muttered, her big blue eyes shining in the darkness. The bag lady's hair stuck out from under a woolly hat in wiry clumps. Thick glasses sat on her nose, lenses catching the light and hiding whatever lay behind them. Her mouth, if that's what it was a thin slit. There was something off about her face, the head in general, but with the light behind her it was hard to make out. She carried on calmly, lifting scraps from the floor, and every so often made that horrible squelching noise, as if she were tasting what she'd found. Betsy's skin prickled. She knew in that instant that the bodies in the room they'd just left and the things going into those bags were related. Alan had had enough. He jerked his head back, shoved Brandon hard in the chest, and mouthed, "Go." They took off. They went in a stumbling, shoving line back the way they'd come, past the broken seats and the silent screen. They went until they burst back into the foyer, and then out into the pale afternoon, the air outside sharper and cleaner than they'd ever known it to be. "I told you she was real," Brandon gasped. Alice just shook her head. She didn't want to hear it. "She didn't see us," Alan said, more to convince himself than anyone else. "Not this time," Rose put in. Betsy looked past them towards the canal. The water moved sluggishly under a skin of thin ice. "We should go home," she said. For once, nobody argued. Part 4. What's in the Bag? Tuesday evening, 22 Buckingham Street felt smaller than usual. Steve came in after 5, smelling of paint, and declared himself knackered before he'd even taken his boots off. They ate another invention involving pasta and whatever had been on offer at the shop. "You all right, love?" Steve asked as they ate. Well, as he ate. "You're quiet." "Just tired," she said. Not too worried about this missing boy, are you? Betsy just shook her head. She wasn't one to lie to her dad. So instead, if there was something on her mind that she wasn't ready to share, she just kept her mouth shut. After tea, they settled in front of the TV, the room lit more by the screen than the cheap supermarket lamp. The 6 o'clock news caught and held their attention. Police were called to the Stockton Canal this afternoon, the presenter said, after the discovery of a body believed to be that of a local man. The report cut to the canal, the very stretch Betsy had contemplated the day before, now cordoned off with blue and white tape. Police and paramedics swarmed the scene. The water behind them was oily black, the ice broken in several places. Her body was recovered from the water, another voice said. Sources describe it as mold, though there is no official confirmation at this time as to cause of death. Reports of a wild animal in the area are being tentatively linked to the incident. Bloody hell, Steve muttered. That's just up the road. Betsy was incapable of movement. She simply sat there, stunned. A grainy shot of the towpath filled the screen, a blurry shape under a blanket, a stretcher, a policeman's hand held up to ward off the camera. Probably one of the poor sods who sleep down there, Steve said, more to himself than to her. Betsy had nothing to say. The cinema, the animals on the floor, the thin wrists of the bag lady, those horrible squelching sounds. Police are appealing for witnesses, the presenter continued, but whatever he said went unheard. Betsy had completely zoned out. When the weather came on, Steve slapped his knees. Right, he said. That's enough misery for one night. You, bath, teeth, bed. Me, washing up, kettle, collapse. Let's get this show on the road. Betsy didn't protest. She went upstairs, ran the bath much too hot and far too deep, then immersed herself until the water cooled and her fingers wrinkled. Even in the steam, she couldn't stop seeing the bag lady's bony, claw-like hands. Finally, it was her dad's calling up the stairs that roused her into action. Teeth, Bets, he said. She did as she was told and got into bed. Steve came in and sat on the edge, his shirt soaked through with pot water. You sure you're all right? He asked again, softer now. If something's bothering you. She stared at the ceiling. A dead man in the canal. A pile of animals at the old cinema. A woman with too many bags and not enough face. I'm just thinking, she said. About what? Stuff. Ah, he sang. Stuff, that old chestnut. Well, he tapped a duvet. Try not to think too hard about stuff right before bedtime, yeah? She nodded timidly. Look, if you're worried about all this missing kid business, just remember, there are grown-ups everywhere. Teachers, neighbours, police. They're not going to let it happen to you. Betsy looked at him. There had been a police car on Valley Road as they'd come home. There had been grown-ups on the towpath when they pulled that man from the canal. Grown-ups everywhere. And yet bad things were still happening. Okay, she said, because he needed her to say it. All right, he murmured. He bent and kissed her on the forehead. Night, kid. He turned off the light, leaving the thin orange glow from the landing the job of illuminating a tiny room. She listened to his footsteps retreat, the creak of the stairs as he descended to satisfy the obvious craving. The house sighed around her, pipes ticking, the telly next door murmuring through the walls. Eventually, the landing light went off as well. Her room went from a dull orange to black. She didn't know how long she lay there before she heard it. At first, she thought it was part of a dream she'd not yet fallen into, a low drone that seemed to seep into the room rather than come from without.
What's in the bag?
The voice was low and strange, every word extended as though speech didn't come naturally. It sounded again, louder this time.
What's in the bag.
Goosebumps riddled Betsy's skin. She shot up, heartbeat loud in her ears. It was coming from outside, from the front of the house, from the grass. She slid out of bed, eased her bedroom door open, and stepped onto the landing. The landing was all in shadow. The tiniest fraction of light floated up from downstairs. The TV was still on. She padded down quietly. Her dad was on the sofa, the TV muttering to itself in the corner. Some late-night talk show now. Two nobodies trading trivialities. "Dad?" she whispered. He snorted awake, blinking. She could smell the cigarette smoke on him. "Huh? You all right? Bad dream?" "Can you hear that?" she said. He frowned, listening. He reached for the remote and killed the TV. The silence that followed was thick.
What's in the bag?
The words drifted through the room, their source the silent world outside. Steve winced. "Did you hear that?" Betsy whispered. "Yeah," he managed. "Yeah, I did." They went together to the window. Steve twitched the curtain an inch. Betsy stood at his elbow, her eyes wide with a quiet terror. The street was an oblong shadow, tightly squeezed by dark, formless houses. The broken street lamp stood like a spectral obelisk. Further up, a functional lamp cast a splash of sodium orange, stopping short of the patch of grass and the no ball game sign. At first, Betsy saw nothing. Then her eyes adjusted. Something was moving, a shape low and hunched, out on the grass, sliding, dragging. It shuffled along the length of the green, from the direction of the bin sheds towards the centre, its pale silhouette just about visible.
What's in the bag?
Steve squinted. "Probably some drunk," he said under his breath. The shape moved on, away from the sign, drifting towards the row of houses opposite, towards 44. "Who lives there?" Betsy asked. "No idea," Steve said. "Never seen anyone go in or out. Probably empty." "It can't be empty," she stated. "The garden's too neat." Across the way, the shadow reached the low fence of 44's immaculate garden. It seemed to hesitate there, a dark smudge against the darker hedge. The voice came one last time, thinner now, as if travelling a considerable distance.
What's in the bag?
Then it was gone, melted into the night. Steve walked her back upstairs, this time leaving the landing light on. "Don't worry about it," he said. Asking her not to worry about things was becoming a habit he swore he'd break after Ellie. But change was difficult for a man in his 40s. Betsy nodded. She wanted to tell her dad about the cinema, the animals and the bag lady, but it was too late. Her immature mind was incapable of organizing her thoughts. Tiredness had her in its grip, and the time had come to yield to it. "Night, Dad," she said, yawning. "Night, love." Steve left her to it. Sleep claimed her almost immediately. Betsy was back in the cinema. Only it wasn't the cinema now. The seats had sunk into the floor, into a hollow crater of sorts. The carpet was gone. In its place, bones, piled high, curved and straight and broken, pale in the gloom. The screen was no longer a screen. It was a matted wall of plastic bags, thousands of them, expanding and contracting like artificial lungs. In the middle of the crater lay the man from the canal. She knew it was him, though she'd never seen his face. One arm lay across his chest, the other ended in a chewed stump. Above him, something moved. A shape, long and dark, slid along the curve of the wall, sinuous as smoke. It approached the prostrate figure, hovered above him in the gloom, then descended with the rapidity and urgency of a starved animal. The horrible squelching sounded again. Betsy tried to run, but her feet were stuck, caught by bony hands that held her fast.
What's in the bag?
She woke with a jolt, her heart battering her ribs. The room was dark. For a second she didn't know where she was, who she was. Then the familiar shape swam into focus. The flat-pack wardrobe, the paint-stained desk, the Lost Boys poster that had followed her from the old house. Under the duvet, Betsy's hands were shaking. Across the street, among the darkened row of houses, a strange voice whispered,
What's in the bag?
Part 5, Number 44. By Wednesday morning, Betsy wasn't sure where her dreams had ended and the night itself had begun, a seemingly endless stretch of darkness that held her in its grip for a handful of eternities. She woke feeling shattered, tired behind the eyes. Steve shouted up the stairs, same as always. "Come on, Bets! World's not going to paint itself." She dressed without thinking and went downstairs. "You sleep any better?" he asked. She nodded, afraid to lie, the bird's nest atop her head broader and taller than ever. "Have some toast, love." She picked up a lukewarm piece, smeared it with butter and marmalade. The little radio muttered on the counter, "Body, canal, Lowther." Give it a rest," Steve snapped, flicking it off. Too early for that nonsense. He dropped a kiss on her head, grabbed his coat and said, "School, straight home, no wandering. If anything weird happens, tell someone, yeah?" "Okay," she said, crunching the toast absently. The chill came after her the moment she stepped outside. She pulled her scarf tighter about her neck, then hollered in the direction of her friends, who were a little way further up the street. "You look rough," Alan announced. "Like, proper rough." "Cheers," Betsy said, catching up. "Trouble sleeping?" Rose asked, with a hint of something in her voice, and the characteristic dark rings around her eyes, to suggest that she too had had a tough time of it. "Yeah," Betsy replied. "The bag lady," Brandon put in, with a firmness that had always been lacking before. Betsy nodded. Alice eyed her warily, but chose not to speak. Something in her manner was also quite telling. At school, the atmosphere was strange. The playground failed to echo with shrill cries and gaudy laughter. Miss Carter's classroom was as hushed as a tomb, and before first lesson, Mr. Lewis appeared again. "I'm afraid," the head teacher said, clasping his hands, smiling emptily. "There's been another development. A second child isn't where he's supposed to be." Silence reigned supreme. "So we're being sensible," he went on. "Straight home after school. No detours, no shops, no parks. Police are keeping an eye on things. If you see anything that makes you feel funny, tell a grown-up immediately. Understood?" A strained, hesitant "yes, sir" answered him. Miss Carter tried to rescue the mood with an attempt at her usual enthusiasm, but it was hopeless. The kids were too far gone. By morning break, the playground buzzed with rumours. "They found blood everywhere," my sister said. "My dad says we might need to move. My mum says we're not allowed outside past 4. Betsy and the others drifted to what had become their customary spot by the fence. "We should tell," Rose whispered suddenly. "About yesterday. The cinema, the animals, and her." "Tell 'em what?" Alan replied, noticing Rose's quick-bitten fingernails. "We'd just get in trouble. No one would believe us anyway," Betsy added quietly. Alice picked at a splinter on the fence. "Miss Carter might believe us," she said. But her words fell on deaf ears. Alan kicked at the tarmac. He seemed to struggle getting his words out. "It's not just the cinema," he managed. The others looked at him. He looked genuinely unnerved. His features were downcast, his eyes bloodshot. "I saw her," he continued. "Last night. The bag lady." "No, you didn't," Alice barked accusingly. He nodded his head violently. "Swear down. I got up for a piss, looked out the window. She was outside, bags and everything. Went right into number 44. Betsy felt a prickle of cold behind her ribs. 44, she mouthed. Alan nodded again, but seemed reluctant to say anything else. No one spoke for a moment. "If she lives on Buckingham," Brandon began. "If she lives on our street," Betsy interrupted, swallowing. "We should pay her a visit." "What?" Alice protested. "We're not breaking into a murderer's house." "Not breaking in," Alan said, siding with Betsy. "Just having a look around. And then telling someone," Rose added, "if we have to." "Yeah," Alan agreed. "You know, just ruling her out." "Ruling a murderer out," Alice went on. "Have you completely lost it?" The bell rang, putting an end to the debate. But the idea stayed with them. It was in the fractions, under the cauliflower at lunchtime, at the top of the rope in PE, the entire afternoon. By 3 p.m., the decision had made itself. "Yes, miss," they all said when Miss Carter asked if they were going straight home. Technically true for the 5 of them. They all lived on Buckingham Street. Steve wouldn't be home till 5. That bought Betsy some time. "Round the back," Alan said, voice low. "Quick!" The back streets of Buckingham were a mess of bins, weeds, and leaning fences, except for number 44, of course. Its rear yard was as tidy as its front. Concrete swept bare, bin lid shut tight, back door a clean, pale, wooden rectangle. Alan tried the handle as a nervous Betsy looked on. Rose and Brandon were just behind them, with Alice still hesitating by the gate. "Locked," Alan stated. "That's that then," Alice said hopefully. "Let's go." Alan stepped back and eyed the window to the left of the door. "Unlocked," he said, noticing that it was ajar. "Don't," Alice pleaded, as the red-headed boy pulled the window further outwards, assessing his ability to slip through. "It's okay, Al," Rose called to her. "Just a quick look." "I'm going in," Alan said. "I'll unlock the door from inside." And before anyone could stop him, he was through the window and fumbling with the bolts on the other side of the door. "Jesus," Brandon mumbled, his timidity returning at a rate of knots. "I really don't like this," Alice said, but by now had joined the others and was inching forward against her will. Seconds later, the fumbling noises ceased, and the door swung open. "In like Flynn," Alan barked, repeating a phrase he'd picked up somewhere and never quite understood. Inside, the kitchen was spotless, scrubbed to within an inch of its life, polished countertops, sparkling sink, and yet a dining table sat in the middle of the room, a dining table covered with dozens of papers, sketches, handwritten lists, newspaper clippings. A pile of maps snagged Betsy's attention. She crouched to inspect them, following the penciled routes with her thumb. One showed Buckingham Street, roughly outlined but recognizable. The patch of grass running through the middle was marked Good. The bin sheds at the far end were circled. Another showed Market Street, shops labelled Offie, Chippy, Paper. Behind them, bins, rotten, keep. There was a map of the canal, bridges drawn in loops, and one spot near Regent Street circled again and again. Sleepers. "She keeps notes," Betsy murmured, "like a postman, but for rubbish." "Hit list," Alan said, dryly. Alice identified another map. She opened it carefully. "Meeting house," she read. A building, an arrow pointing downwards. The word cellar. Then heavy, open later. What does it mean? Brandon whispered. Sounds like she found something she couldn't shove into a bag, Betsy surmised. Alice took the map under a jumper, trembling. We can look at it tomorrow. At school, maybe. Not here. Betsy scanned the room again. Alan had spotted the bin. He moved towards it. Don't, Betsy hissed. He backed off, more startled than obedient. And then they heard the sound. A heavy thump. The 5 of them froze. Another thump, heavier, from below. Cellar, Brandon whispered. A third sound followed, something like a door closing somewhere deeper in the house, accompanied by a very familiar growling. Out of here, Betsy yelled under her breath. Now! They bolted. Out through the door, down the back street, round the corner, running until their legs gave out, and they collapsed against the fence belonging to Jack Dobson, cabinet maker. What were we thinking? Rose gasped. Told you, Brandon said, pale as paper. We're alive, aren't we? Alan blurted triumphantly. No thanks to you. This from a trembling Alice. Betsy didn't have it in her to speak. Whatever they'd heard in there, whatever they'd disturbed, had put the fear of God into her. The group parted ways quietly. 5 rebellious children who needed to return to the safety of home as promptly as possible. On reaching 22, Betsy locked the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment. Rose was right. What on earth had they been thinking? Was the woman across the street really up to no good? An old lady who collected rubbish? A simple nobody who kept her garden neat and tidy? Betsy climbed the stairs, entered her bedroom and went straight to the window. 44 sat all prim and correct. Nothing out of place, no movement behind the curtains. But something lived in that place, something that mapped its world meticulously, something that passed for an old woman, but was, in all likelihood, something else entirely. Part 6. The Cabinet Maker. Jack Dobson locked up later than usual. He blamed the cold. It got into the wood, got into his hands, those painful, arthritic digits that continued to slow him down. The little workshop at the end of Buckingham Street had reeked of sawdust and glue since 1978. But tonight there was something else in the air, something vaguely unpleasant, like the odour of the stagnant canal. The cabinet maker swept offcuts into a corner, straightened the planks he intended to plane in the morning, then went for his coat. He checked the till, empty but for change, and flicked off the lights. The workshop sank into shadow, save for the faint glow from the tired street lamp opposite. But wait. There was no glow. The lamp was out. For a man in his late 50s, Jack was more superstitious than he cared to admit. There was something about dead bulbs that haunted him, like eyes that couldn't see. He shuddered. What might choose to dwell beneath a lifeless street lamp? Dark ones? Ghostly silhouettes with claws for hands? Nah, that had just been his granddad's way of teaching him to stick to the light. He tugged his hat lower, turned the key in the lock, then shoved it into his pocket. A sound made him pause. Something rough and heavy dragged across tarmac. Was there something out there in the night? The cabinet maker had heard about the missing kids. Who hadn't? Lowther wasn't the sort of place that kept secrets very long. They had a way of getting about, drifting from place to place like phantoms. People were frightened. Sensible people. The sort of folk who didn't frighten easily. The sound came again, closer this time. Jack's hand tightened around the key in his pocket. "All right," he murmured to himself. "Who's there, then? Come on, let's have a look at you." An eerie silence followed, in which Jack's imagination did somersaults. He exhaled, annoyed at himself. "Daft sod," he muttered. "Here a fox, and suddenly—" A figure blocked the entrance to the yard. He struggled to perceive it at first, though it was somewhat familiar. It inched forward a fraction, paused. A handful of carrier bags exaggerated the silhouette, clinked together in the cold evening air, rustling like plastic wings. Jack's throat tightened. Again, the figure shuffled forward, and the cabinet maker realized who it was. The bag lady, at least that's what folk called her. Naturally, he'd seen her before. Everyone had. Usually from a distance, moving slowly along the canal path, sifting through rubbish with the industrious air of someone inspecting treasure. But there was something off about her now. She was bigger, bulkier. An odour filled the yard that was a mixture of rotten wood and the back of a bin lorry. "Evening," Jack managed, though the word caught on his dry tongue. The bag lady didn't respond. Her head jerked towards him. The woolly hat atop it sat crooked. Beneath it, the wiry patches of hair that stuck out were thin, like dry grass. The bulky glasses she wore were smaller somehow. Her head seemed inhumanly large.
"What's in the bag?"
she said, in a voice that seemed completely alien to the cabinet maker, a voice that was both shrill and coarse at the same time. I'm sorry," Jack managed. I'm not carrying a bag, love." The woman took another step forward, bag shifting and clacking as if something inside them was trying to move. Jack's heart pounded. He glanced down the street. Nobody out there, nobody to intervene. Buckingham was always quiet around tea time, especially in December, folk barricading themselves indoors in front of the fire.
"What's in the bag?"
the bag lady repeated, raising an arm as the words left her mouth, a mouth that was impossible to see in the shadowy yard. The cabinet maker saw the outline of her wrist, a bony wrist attached to a curiously and troublingly oversized hand, a bloated hand that floated in the air above her head like a misshapen balloon. Jack took a step back. "Right, okay, look, I'm closing up. Time to go home, yeah?" But the bag lady continued to inch forward, agonizingly slowly, the balloon-like hand hovering. Her distorted shadow spilled across the pavement. Jack winced as it came into contact with his boots. He reached behind him, fingers fumbling for the workshop door handle he'd just locked. If he could just whip the key out and... His left foot nudged something. A bin bag, a large one. "Take it," he said quickly, shoving it towards her with his boot. "It's yours. I don't want anything to do with—" The bag lady, who by now was within spitting distance, leaned forward and opened the bag, an awkward task with such swollen hands. Jack chanced a quick glance inside and instantly regretted it. The contents of the bag turned his stomach. He couldn't be absolutely certain. The light, after all, was poor, but he thought he saw fur, feathers, something small and limp, flesh-coloured. A torn ear? "Christ almighty!" he yelled. The bag lady straightened. Her glasses caught the faintest shimmer of moonlight. Her mouth, that hitherto hidden orifice, opened, a thin slit widening, hinting at something soft and dark inside.
"What's in the bag?"
The last word ended in a watery, squelching sound. Jack turned and went for the door, his frozen arthritic fingers grasping wildly for the key that was now deep in his trouser pocket. He didn't shout, couldn't manage a word. His ability to speak was somewhere else, caught in the space behind his teeth, as the cold air knifed his throat. With a triumphant snort, He extracted the key and shoved it into the lock. He could feel the bulk of the bag lady edging towards him. What the hell was she doing? Was this hag really after him? Or had the strangeness of the situation simply served to work him up into a frenzy? These thoughts raced through his mind as he fumbled with the lock. Sore though his fingers were, he succeeded in unlocking the door and threw it open like a man possessed. In he leapt, filled with a vitality he hadn't known since youth. As he forced the door closed behind him, he caught one final glimpse of the bag lady in all her terrible glory. A bloated blob under a woolly hat, thick bin bags passing for outer garments, shiny under the moonlight. A face that was like a mask with the features sketched on top. Glasses that veiled the eyes that lived behind them. And those appalling hands, puffy and pale, they seemed to wave at him as the door flung to. Jack locked the door and fell to his knees, chest heaving. He had to tell someone. But even as he thought it, something tightened in his stomach. What exactly would he be telling? That an old woman made him feel uncomfortable? That she'd shown him a sack full of mangled animals? That she'd grown, changed, become something monstrous? Nah, he muttered to himself. They'll think I've lost the plot. Maybe I have. Digging deep for courage, he climbed to his feet and crept to the only window that overlooked the yard. He swallowed hard as he stuck his head in front of it. The yard was empty. Part 7. The Basement on the Map. Thursday, 4 days since the strangeness began, and Lowther felt different. It was colder, darker, emptier somehow, as though the town had been lifted away in the night, rearranged behind the scenes, and set back down before dawn. Betsy woke with the same painful tiredness she'd carried all week. Her dreams had slipped away the moment she opened her eyes, but the essence of them remained, dancing shadows at the back of her mind, bloated shapes pressing inwards from her ribs. Steve was downstairs, always the first to rise, radio on low. The familiar smell of burnt toast filled the house. "Morning," he said, as Betsy entered the kitchen, looking up from the frying pan. "Scrambled eggs?" She shook her head. "Just grab some toast, then." "Okay." He pushed a plate towards her, toast cut roughly in half, and watched her pick at it, crusts first at that. "What's going on with you?" he asked. "Just tired, Dad." "Yeah, but you've been just tired all week." She didn't reply. She couldn't, not without saying something she wasn't ready to explain. Steve sighed, ruffled her hair, and said, "Well, you know I'm always here if you need to talk. I know it's hard at the moment. Feels like it's been hard forever." And with that, Betsy's thoughts turned to her mother. She missed her mum, it was only natural. But she didn't remember her the way her dad did. She'd been too small, too young to recall the myriad components that made her mum the woman she was. There were photographs, dozens of them, all faded and rough round the edges, 4 by 3 inches square, muted smiles, frozen cuddles. She looked up at Steve. "I'm sorry, Dad." "What for?" he said, immediately rushing to her side to put an arm round her. "You know, for being a pain." Steve huffed at that. "A pain? When?" That seemed to crack Betsy's porcelain mask. The two of them shared a rare laugh. "Now come on," Steve said. "Get that toast down you." When Betsy emerged from number 22 at something past 8, Buckingham Street met her like a ghost. Curtains that normally twitched were firmly shut. Doors stayed closed. Even the pigeons seemed to hop about more cautiously, as though the rumours of the missing had reached their ears too. Only 44 looked unchanged. Much to her delight, Alan, Alice, Rose, and Brandon were gathered by the no ball game sign, stamping frost from their shoes. "You look even worse today," Alan said casually, as though the observation was of some practical use to her. "Thanks," she returned, scowling at him. "I didn't sleep either," Rose muttered between chattering teeth. "I kept thinking I heard scratching." "I heard bins being moved," Brandon whispered. 3 a.m. Alan just stared at him. No playful banter, no slap on the back. "Yeah, well," Alice cut in, "let's just get to school." They set off in a tight cluster, heads down, breath puffing in the cold. When they reached Market Street, 2 police cars were parked outside the laundrette. A group of officers stood by the entrance, arms folded, faces drawn. "What's happened, do you think?" Rose whispered. "Don't look," Alice said. "Just keep walking." But it was impossible not to look. The door of the laundrette sat half open, tape over the handle. Through the gap, Betsy glimpsed a washing machine door hanging ajar, the white drum within streaked with something dark. Her stomach lurched. The kids hurried the last few steps to the school gates, where teachers shepherded children inside with the strange smiles of people pretending everything was all right. But it wasn't. Miss Carter looked exhausted. Her hair was worse than Betsy's, and her cardigan hung unevenly, as though she'd forgotten how to button it. "Coats off, please. Come on, quietly." The class obeyed. Even Alan did as he was told, without so much as a grunt. Miss Carter clasped her hands in front of her. "Before we begin," she said, "Mr. Lewis is going to speak to you. He's going class to class as we speak." Before long, Betsy felt the now familiar sinking sensation as Mr. Lewis appeared in the doorway. "Morning," he began, omitting the good, his voice tinged with something like reluctance. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Every child in the room stiffened. There has been... He searched the ceiling for the word, but found nothing to soften the blow. There has been an incident at the laundrette on Market Street. The police are investigating, and it appears to be connected to the 2 missing children. Rose covered her mouth. Alan stopped breathing altogether. Betsy's hands curled around the edge of her desk. Mr. Lewis went on. "I'm not going to lie to you. This is serious. School is safe. Home is safe. But outdoors we must be very careful. From today, a temporary curfew is being introduced. Everyone is to be indoors before 4 o'clock. You must go straight home after school. Do not stop anywhere. Do not speak to anyone you don't know." He paused, and silence remained heavy in the room. Betsy thought the headmaster's crow's feet looked darker and more carved in than ever. The man was sweating. She pitied him somehow. "If you see anything unusual," he resumed, "anything that makes you uncomfortable, you tell a grown-up. That includes us. We are here for you." He nodded at Miss Carter and withdrew, rather hastily, Betsy thought. Miss Carter tried, with everything she had, to bring some life back into the room. She read a poem about the daily trials of a hedgehog. She told them about a school trip years ago when the headmaster tripped and fell into a duck pond. She went so far as to offer a free period, but nothing seemed to lift the mood. By mid-afternoon, the pale winter sun pushed weakly through the clouds, but it did nothing to brighten the classroom. Betsy watched dust motes drift lazily through the air, listened to the occasional groan of the room's sizable radiator, and felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Then Alice nudged her. "The map," Alice whispered, slipping a hand into a jumper to tap the folded paper hidden there. "We need to look at it later, remember?" Betsy nodded. "But we're not going back to that house," Rose said, overhearing. "No," Betsy agreed. "We're not." Alan leaned over. "We're going to the place on the map." "Alan, no," Alice began, but he cut her off. "It's not an house. It's empty. Nobody lives there. Well, that's what Bran said anyway." Brandon bristled. I didn't say nobody lived there. I said nobody uses it. It belongs to the Quakers. 4 blank faces met Brandon's. You know, he went on, keeping his voice down, they're a religious bunch. They have meeting houses all over the place. How do you know so much about them? Rose asked, frowning. Dunno, he replied. Think my mum knows one. Doesn't matter who it belongs to, Alan interrupted. All that matters is that it's empty. The map said cellar, heavy, open later. The bag lady found something in there, and I want to know what it was. But when? Alice hissed. There's a curfew. And if we break it and our parents find out? Who cares? Alan protested. That woman is up to something. We saw her notes and those noises under the floorboards yesterday. Brandon shuddered. And if the police are looking in the wrong place, Alan went on, then someone has to look in the right place. Betsy listened, chewing her lip. She knew Alan was right about one thing. The maps weren't just scribbles. They were instructions, a guide for navigating Lowther unnoticed. If the rumours were true, the bag lady could appear and disappear at a moment's notice, in and out of ginnels, over and under bridges. The woman knew the shortcuts, the workarounds, buildings out of use, land unadopted. Betsy nodded, more to herself than in agreement with Alan. Going to the meeting house was dangerous. Dangerous in a way yesterday's housebreak had only hinted at. But still, a cellar, some mysterious object too heavy to carry, open later. How could a 9-year-old resist a call like that? It was home time. Straight home now, Miss Carter reminded them. Straight home. Betsy had nodded, but her feet carried her with the others to the end of Market Street, away from Buckingham, away from safety. They passed the laundrette, innocently enough. Police tape fluttered in the cold air. 2 officers guarded the entrance, speaking in low, urgent tones. Betsy saw a woman crying into a policeman's jacket, saw the officers' tight mouths, knew only too well what had been found in that dark drum. Come on, Alan hissed, darting away from the scene. They followed the red-headed boy out of sight of the officers and into a ginnel a few doors down. Right, Alan said, breath steaming, eyes bright with fear. Map me. Alice hesitated, then pulled it out. The drawing was rough. A square building, stairs descending. A cylindrical object sketched in the corner, note scrawled in an untidy hand. This is stupid, Rose said. Let's go and check it out, Alan announced. Now? Brandon squeaked. In the dark? Yeah. No way. It's not too far from here, Alan said reasonably. Come on, we're just 5 kids walking home. And what do we do if we actually find something? Alice demanded, a dark fringe tickling her nose. Alan just shrugged his shoulders. He hadn't thought that far. Betsy spoke up. We see what's there and tell someone if we have to. Tell who? Brandon pleaded. Betsy thought of Miss Carter's tired face, her dad's weary eyes, Mr. Lewis's wringing hands. Anyone, she repeated. Anyone who'll listen. Rose wrapped her arms around herself. I don't like this. Neither do I, Betsy said. But if the bag lady's up to something, and those boys, the ones in the laundrette, if there's even a tiny chance that what she found at the meeting house is connected, then we have to try. She surprised herself with a certainty in her voice. It was the most she'd said aloud in weeks. The others stared at her. They didn't know it, but they'd just made her their leader. All right then, Alan said quietly. Let's do it. Part 8. The Meeting House. The meeting house stood at the end of a short, narrow lane off Market Street, a brick building with a slanted roof, the sort of structure most people walk past without seeing. Modest, quiet, easily overlooked. At this late hour, under a leaden sky, it seemed to shrink even further, as though trying to disappear from view. The kid stopped at the mouth of the lane. "That's it," Alan said, somewhat disappointed. "Thought it'd be bigger." "That's the point," Brandon murmured. "Quakers aren't show-offs." Rose pulled her scarf up around her chin. "We should go home," she whispered. "I can't be late. My mum will kill me." Alice looked at her watch. "It's nearly 3:30. We've got about half an hour." Betsy stared at the building. Like Lowther in general, there was nothing remarkable about it. Not a single broken window. No evidence of vandalism. Nothing to suggest anyone had ever forced their way inside. In fact, it was tidier than most places in Lowther, with the exception of number 44, Buckingham Street. "What if we can't get in?" Rose said, hopeful. "Then we go home," Betsy replied. It was the obvious response. "If it's open, we'll take a look." "And then we go home," Alice insisted, sniffling. Betsy nodded distractedly. The group crept forward, careful to remain inconspicuous, a difficult task for a bunch of anxious kids. The meeting house sat behind a low iron gate that opened with a reluctant creak. A gravel path cut through a patch of dry, winter-browned grass. A wooden bench leaned under one of the windows, its paint flaking. Alan reached the door first, a heavy, old-fashioned thing with a square glass pane. He gave the handle a twist. It opened. "No way," he breathed. Rose whimpered. "Can we please just tell someone instead?" "And say what?" Alan snapped. "An old woman drew a map, so now we're investigating. They'll think we're stupid." Betsy wasn't sure what they'd think, but it wasn't their opinions that troubled her. It was what her dad might think. He was open-minded enough. He'd proved that more than once. The whole thing under the bed fiasco was a good example. But this wasn't just imagination running wild. Something was happening in Lowther. Something to do with the bag lady, the missing kids, and the man in the canal. Somehow, she didn't want to lay any of it on her dad. He'd been through enough. They both had. Inside, the meeting house was a single large chamber, plain wooden pews arranged in a square facing inwards, as though in readiness for guests who'd never arrived. The place was chilly and still, the faint odour of dust and old mysterious books hanging in the silence. "No lights," Alan muttered, flicking the nearest switch. Nothing happened. "Just the window," Brandon whispered, pointing to a small frosted panel high up on the far wall. It threw down a thin wedge of pale streetlight onto the floor. "Not enough to see by," Rose said. "Then stay close," Betsy replied. Alice unfolded the map, holding it up to the thin light. "There's a door on the left wall," she said, tapping the sketch. "Stairs behind it." "The cellar," Brandon added, pressing his lips together firmly. "Come on," Alan said. The left wall was ordinary enough. Smooth plaster, fading white paint, a couple of old notice boards pinned with yellowed flyers about charity events from years past. But at the far end was a door, half hidden behind a stack of unused chairs. "There," Alan whispered. Rose grumbled again. A voice inside her told her it was a bad idea to go fumbling about behind that door. Alice, as if sensing her friend's panic mounting, put an arm around her shoulder. "Remember what you said to me yesterday?" she said softly. "Just a quick look." Rose smiled emptily, put on a brave face. Betsy tried the handle. It turned. The door opened onto a descending flight of stairs, steep and thick with shadow. The top steps were visible in the weak spill from the main room, but the rest were swallowed by the unforgiving darkness. "Oh, no," Rose said, backing away. I can't go down there." "You don't have to," Alice said. "Stay here or keep watch at the door." Rose snorted, casting furtive glances left and right. Okay, I'll stay here." Betsy squeezed her hand before stepping past her. The rest of them, Alice, Alan, Brandon, and Betsy, peered down the stairs. "It's pretty dark," Alan whispered, the slightest tremble in his voice. Alice blinked. "Do you think we should give it a miss?" "No," he said affirmatively. "I want to know what's down there. We need to know. And I think," he went on, taking the first couple of steps, "there's light down there." And as they descended, the dim outline of a small rectangular shape emerged on the far wall. "Told you," Alan managed. A tiny window, grimy, half buried in the earth outside, filtered a faint slither of streetlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make out shapes, boxes stacked along the walls, old chairs, rolled carpets, and something else. In the corner, exactly where the bag lady's map had indicated, sat a large, cylindrical object, iron or steel, with a handle and a hatch, partially open. "It's a barrel," Alice whispered. "No," Brandon said. "It's a storage drum. My dad has one a lot like it. It keeps tools in it." Alan crept closer. Betsy remained where she was, her eyes unfocused, her mind racing. Heavy. Open later. The words felt like ice in her chest. Alan crept closer still, reaching for the drum. "Don't," Alice hissed. "Alan, seriously, don't." His fingers found the handle. "Wait," Betsy put in. But it was too late. Alan had pulled the hatch wide open and was squinting to get a look at its contents. "It's empty," he announced. "Nothing in the bloody thing." And he was right. The storage drum, as Brandon had labelled it, contained nothing but shadows. The bag lady, who had marked the object as heavy, open later, had evidently returned to do exactly that. Betsy felt eyes on her in that moment, a sensation akin to having disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed. And though the original trespasser was the strange old woman, she couldn't help but feel like she'd acquired some of that mysterious something, that it clung to her shoes and coat, filtered through her hair and sank into her skin, and that the majority of it, whatever it was, had found a home in the bag lady. "We need to leave," she said flatly. The others agreed non-verbally, and the four of them rushed back up the dark stairs. They met Rose at the top, grabbed her by the arm, and ran hell for leather through the pew-filled chamber, exiting the meeting house post-haste. "What does it mean?" Alice managed when she'd finally recovered enough to speak. The group had just reached Market Street, and were doing their best to look unassuming, in spite of the heavy breathing from all parties. The clock above the old town hall displayed 4:05 p.m., and as such they were the recipients of numerous critical glances from passers-by. The police presence, fortunately, was still largely in the vicinity of the laundrette, which was some distance off and wouldn't be passed on the way back to Buckingham Street. "Beats me," Alan said, his cheeks redder than ever. "What did you see down there?" Rose asked at last, directing the question at Betsy. "That's just it," Betsy replied. "There was nothing down there. Just a bunch of furniture and an empty barrel." She liked to think of the object as a simple barrel, less of a threat to her and her friends than a storage drum, a drum that had once contained... what exactly? "Then why the hell did we all have to run like that?" Rose demanded. Brandon sighed heavily. Alan mirrored him. Alice simply said, "Because Betsy felt something down there." "Felt something?" Rose mumbled. "Yeah," Betsy said, as the group approached the turn-off for Buckingham. But that was all she could say on the matter, as further along Market Street, somewhere between Pat Green's salon and Jimmy Davis' butcher, all hell broke loose. Part 9. Carnage on Market Street. At first, it sounded like fireworks. A sharp crack split the air, followed by another and another. Betsy flinched instinctively, her shoulders drawing up as the noise bounced off the shop fronts ahead. "What was that?" Rose whispered. They were close to the turn-off for Buckingham now, by the charity shop with its flickering tube lights. The sky above had faded to a dirty blue-grey, the last of the day bleeding away. Another sound followed, an unmistakable sound. A scream. It came from further up the street, shrill and raw. Alan stopped dead. "Shit," he mouthed. A crowd surged into view ahead of them. People spilled out of doorways, faces pale, movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Move!" someone yelled. "Back! Get back!" A man stumbled, fell to his knees. Another dragged him upright by the collar and half carried him away. Somewhere glass shattered, an echoing crash that sent pigeons exploding from a nearby roof. "We need to go," Alice blurted, her voice thin. But Betsy couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the pavement, eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding ahead. There was something in the very air, like the moment before a storm breaks, and threading through it all was a stench she recognized instantly. Bins, waste, something sweet and spoiled. "Oh, no," Brandon breathed. "Oh, no! Oh, no!" The crowd parted. Something huge moved at its center, an indeterminate black mass, fabric perhaps, or shadow. But then it shifted, and Betsy knew what it was. A body swollen far beyond human proportions, wrapped in layers of dark material that dragged and snagged along the ground. Black bin bags were woven into it, knotted together like crude armor, their contents bulging and sagging obscenely. It was the bag lady, or at least what the old woman had become. The creature towered above the dispersing crowd, its strange head brushing the hanging sign of the Howard Carter Pharmacy. Its arms were grotesquely long, hands enormous, fingers thick as sausages. Where its face should have been was something mask-like and rigid, smooth, pale, with the thick glasses still perched absurdly on its nose. Behind them, its deep-set eyes glinted mysteriously. Then Betsy saw its mouth, but it had ceased to be a mouth. It was a vast, gaping maw that opened and closed as the thing shuffled forward, wet and dark, rimmed with teeth, yellow and uneven.
"What?"
the creature intoned, its voice no longer thin or distant, but booming and warped, vibrating in Betsy's chest.
"What's in the bag?"
A woman screamed as a giant hand closed around her arm. There was a sickening crack, bones snapping like dry wood, and the woman was plucked from the ground. People scattered in every direction, some tripping, some dropping bags and coats in their haste to escape. The bag lady lifted the poor woman with terrifying ease and dragged her towards that yawning mouth. There was a brief, awful moment when the woman's face was brightly lit by the headlights of a passing car, bulging wide, lips parted, before she vanished into what can only be described as a monstrous cavern. The sounds that followed were unbearable. Rose gagged. Brandon doubled over, retching. Alan, finding his voice at last, yelled, "Come on! Come on!" He clutched at his staring friends as the bag lady roared, an inhuman screech that rattled windows and set off car alarms. The children ran. Somewhere behind them, another horrifying scream was prematurely stifled. Sirens wailed in the distance. Like sheep driven into a pen, the group crammed themselves into a ginnel between the greengrocers and a derelict building. "What do we do?" Rose sobbed. "We've got to get out of here," Alan yelled. The children took turns peeking out of the ginnel, watching the madness unfold from their questionable hiding place. A police car screeched onto the road, lights blazing. An officer leapt out, shouting into a radio. his face ashen. "Off the street!" he bellowed, waving people away. "Everybody, off the street!" The bag lady edged forward along the emptying road, squeezing between parked cars, leaving dents and shattered mirrors in its wake. Betsy's mind raced. The canal. It was nearby, hidden behind the shops, accessible by means of another passage not too far from where they stood. She wasn't keen on the idea of the dark, stagnant water, the recent repository of a dead body, but anything was better than remaining where they were. "This way!" she shouted. Without waiting to see if her friends even heard her, she took off, back onto Market Street and along the chaotic stretch between their temporary hiding place and the looming black mass that was hurtling towards them. The desired ginnel was barely wide enough for two people abreast, bins stacked high on either side. Betsy, followed at last by her friends, dashed through it mindlessly. The canal lay before them, black and sluggish, a thin layer of ice still clinging to its surface. They ran along the towpath, shoes slipping on damp stone. Somewhere behind them, the bag lady bellowed again. Had she abandoned the busy high street? "She's following us," Rose screamed. "No way," Betsy yelled, though her lungs burned and her legs threatened to buckle. Ahead, the path dipped beneath a low bridge. Shadows pooled there, thick and concealing. The children plunged into darkness, just as something enormous crashed down onto the towpath behind them. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, knocking Brandon off his feet. He cried out as Alan dragged him up again, hauling him onwards. Under the bridge, the air was colder, the stench of the canal overpowering. The bag lady's terrible voice rolled after them.
"What's in the bag?"
Betsy's chest tightened. She thought of the empty drum in the cellar. The proximity of the bag lady called it to mind. Why was that? Exposing herself to the drum had made her aware of something, made them all aware. But none were able to speak of what it was right then, cowered as they were in the gloom of the bridge, listening to the awkward, heavy footfalls of the Market Street monster. "We need to keep moving," Betsy announced, and up they leapt. They burst back out into the open beyond the bridge, skidding to a stop as the towpath met a passage leading up to Buckingham. "There!" Alice panted. But before they could move, the bag lady emerged from under the bridge. There in the twilight, Betsy could see the seams in its black dress, hand-stitched and crude, struggling to contain the bulk beneath. Its glasses hung crookedly from its mask-like face now, lenses cracked and filthy. The children were glued to the spot, rabbits in the headlights. But the bag lady hardly noticed them. It turned to the bridge, laid its swollen hands on the old stones. Like a monstrous spider or some bloated black lizard, it scrambled up the wall, the sound of rustling plastic reverberating across the icy surface of the canal. Moments later, it reached the top and shuffled away into the gloom above. The children had seen enough. They ran. They didn't stop until Buckingham rose up ahead of them, the familiar shapes of the terraces cutting through the night. They collapsed onto the grass by the no ball game sign, gasping, shaking, horrified. Sirens filled the air. Flashing blue lights danced across the murky sky. Betsy stared at number 44 across the way, its immaculate garden much like a mask, a veneer concealing infection and decay. Whatever had lived there, whatever had grown there, was loose now, and Lowther would never be the same again. Part 10. The Quaker's Secret. There was no school on Friday. Betsy woke to the strange hush of a weekday without a timetable, the house not quite sure what it was meant to be doing, the low murmur of the television downstairs, and the steady, restless clink of a teaspoon against a mug. She pulled her duvet up to her chin and lay still for a moment, listening. A newsreader's voice carried faintly through the floorboards. Unidentified assailant. Tragic events in Lowther. Police are appealing for witnesses. Betsy swung her legs out of bed and dressed without need of a prompt. Her hair was a mound the shape of a ghastly black mass, the shape of a thing she saw each and every time she closed her eyes. Downstairs, Steve sat on the sofa in yesterday's clothes, shoulders hunched, mug in hand. The living room was lit by the TV's cold glow. On the screen, Market Street looked like it belonged to a different world. Blue and white tape, police vans, a reporter with a stern expression stamped on his face. "You hungry?" he asked as Betsy entered the room, glancing at her absently. She shook her head. "Me neither," he muttered, and took another sip of the pale brown stuff. Betsy watched him. There was a tightness about him. A man braced for action. "You all right, Dad?" she asked quietly. Steve looked at her then, properly. The concern in his eyes was immediate. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "The world's gone mad." Betsy sank into the armchair next to him, knees tucked up. The stench of the canal still filled her nostrils, and those wet, crunching sounds. The news report cut briefly to the canal, footage from earlier in the week. The towpath cordoned off, a policeman holding a hand up to block the lens. Then back to Market Street, to the question everyone was asking. What was it? Where had it gone? A knock sounded at the door. Steve frowned. "Stay there," he told Betsy, as though she might suddenly leap up and sprint into the waiting arms of danger. He crossed the hallway, peered through the spy hole, then opened the door suspiciously. A man stood there, a thin chap in his late 60s. He wore a neat dark suit, far too formal for Buckingham Street. The trousers neatly ironed, the jacket glossy and sharp. His cold grey eyes were like slits with black, pupilless blobs at the centre. "Morning," Steve said wearily. "Can I help you?" The man swallowed. I apologize for calling unannounced." His voice was as thin as the man himself, clipped and flat. Steve just stared at him, as if to say, "Go on." The caller cleared his throat. "My name isn't important," he said. "Not really, but I'm here on behalf of the Society of Friends." Steve blinked. "The what?" "Quakers," the man said quickly. Betsy, listening by the door in the living room, felt something in her stomach turn. Something slid into place. "Oh," Steve said, only fractionally less baffled. "And what do you want exactly?" The man glanced down the street, seemed to eye number 44 carefully. Then the dead street lamp. "Please," he went on. "May I come in? He wet his lips. "It isn't safe to speak out here." Steve hesitated. There was something about the man's face, the twitching eye, the shade of fear it wore, that pushed him to yield. "All right," he said, dropping his guard for the moment. The Quaker entered, his dark eyes scanning the interior quizzically. Betsy edged away from the living room door. She didn't want to be seen, just wanted to listen. The Quaker's gaze shot towards the living room. From where he stood, he could see the television and winced at the ongoing news report, the worried faces and the ruined shop fronts. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Steve stared at him, tried to process the twisted expression on the man's face. The Quaker drew a breath, then spoke as if reciting something he'd been practicing in advance. "Your daughter visited the local meeting house yesterday." Steve glanced at Betsy's shoes by the radiator, her coat hanging neatly on the peg. The girl herself held her breath. "You mean the place on Warren Road?" "Yes," the Quaker said. I'm obligated to keep an eye. Steve folded his arms. Go on, and this time he really said it. In the cellar there, the man began, drawing a breath the length of a pool cue. Items are kept in storage, items gathered by travelling men and explorers in days gone by. Call it a collection, if it pleases you. Steve's brow furrowed. What kind of items? The man's eyes danced again towards the living room, caught sight of Betsy's shadow. Odds and ends, curios, that sort of thing. Right, Steve said, somewhat impatiently. And what, my daughter was poking about in there? Listen, the man said, stepping a little too close to Steve for comfort. There was something down there, kept for many years, that, unfortunately, was very recently disturbed. Steve made to call out to Betsy, but the thin man put a restraining hand on his arm. The hand was deathly pale and icy cold. This thing, the man said, trembling now, escaped. Fleshless it is, bloodless, like air, like breath. It roams and roams, entirely unseen, and until it finds somewhere to live. Steve let out a short, humourless laugh. What do you want? It embeds itself, the Quaker cut in a host, a person, and once it's inside, it feeds. Betsy felt her skin prickle. Feeds? Feeds on what? Steve asked, very quietly now, one half of him stupidly curious, the other half eager to toss the stranger out onto the street. The belly of the bodiless is never full, the Quaker said, nodding strangely. It is hungry, always hungry, hungry for animals, carrion, until... Steve's jaw clenched. The Quaker swallowed audibly. Until it needs something more to satisfy its craving. A silence settled in the hallway, and in the passing of those quiet moments, Steve seemed to recover his senses. All right, he said. That's enough. But, the Quaker cut in, his eyes shining with something like grief. The host cannot sustain it indefinitely. Eventually, it must leave. Goes in search of a new host. Betsy thought of the maw, the cracking bone, the wet, chewing sounds. She pressed a hand over her mouth. Steve sighed, rolled his eyes. Well, what is it? Where did it come from? It was recovered in the mid-19th century, the thin man said, seemingly relieved to have been given another chance to speak. An archaeological dig in the Balkans, they say. A burial site. Steve's voice hardened. So what's it got to do with me and my daughter? Your daughter has become entangled, he said softly. She and her friends discovered the empty vessel, so now it knows them. Such is the nature of the relationship between it and its prison. Betsy felt an awful chill, as if someone had spoken her name from a distance. Steve's mouth opened and closed. He wanted to doubt the man, write him off as a lunatic, but somehow he couldn't. If there was the slightest possibility Betsy was in danger, then it was his fatherly duty to protect her. The Quaker continued, pushing on before courage could fail him. The current host, he said, is a woman named Cecelia Davenport. Who? Betsy knew. The name hit her like a slap, even though she'd never heard it before. It belonged to the neat garden, the silent house, the woman the kids called the bag lady. The Quaker flinched again. Ask your daughter. Steve took a step back, hands raking through his hair. Okay, I think it's time to leave. I just want you to understand, the Quaker went on. Understand what? That there's a monster roaming the streets? A monster that wants to eat my daughter? Come on. The Quaker met his gaze, dark eyes serious. Yes. Silence again. In the living room, the TV continued its steady churn of half-truths. The Quaker shifted, as though realizing he had said as much as he could, as much as he should about the strange entity in their midst. A terrible task must be performed, he said. Keep your daughter behind closed doors." He turned to leave. Steve didn't stop him. He stood rigid, as if his frame was caught between disbelief and some deeper, more terrifying recognition. The Quaker stepped out onto the front step and paused. For a moment, he looked up and down Buckingham Street, shoulders hunched against the cold. Then his gaze lifted to number 44 and its immaculate garden. He studied it the way an explorer studies the mouth of a cave. "Fire burns eternally in the belly of the bodiless," he said cryptically, then walked away, disappearing into the pale morning. Steve closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut, shaking his head. Betsy retreated to the armchair, her mind racing. She understood now, some of what was going on at least. Steve straightened, slipped on the familiar mask of calm, and drifted into the living room. Betsy stared at him. He seemed to hesitate, looked like he wanted to say something, but wasn't quite sure how to say it. Just stay inside today, yeah? No messing about, curfew or not." He wasn't going to tell her about the visitor, wasn't going to tell her what the thin man had said. And Betsy wasn't going to ask. To ask would create a situation, an atmosphere, as Steve would describe it. Betsy nodded obediently. Better her dad wasn't aware of the big picture. He might do more to restrain her, if that was the case. No, she'd find a way to communicate with her friends, to formulate a plan of action. Perhaps she'd sneak out after lunch, visit them one by one. Something had to be done about Cecelia Davenport. Part 11. The Nest. Lowther was quiet. Quiet in a way Betsy had never known before. A deliberate stillness, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Curtains remained drawn long past noon, doors stayed shut. The grim canal mausolean in its stark silence. Betsy waited until Steve had retreated to the back room. Tools laid out on the table in an effort to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering. She listened for the scrape of a chair, the rattle of a drawer. When she was sure he was occupied, she slipped upstairs and went to her bedroom window. Alice's curtains twitched almost immediately, her bedroom window just about visible from Betsy's. Betsy held up a finger and pointed down the street. Alice nodded, repeating the gesture. Further along, beyond Betsy's field of vision, the rest of the group was similarly stirred. Rose by the living room window, Brandon standing in the front yard, Alan, as it transpired, out on the grass practicing kick-ups with his older brother. It's funny how children know things instinctively. How Betsy's waving of an index finger resulted in the gathering that shortly followed. Not a single word was exchanged, and yet each and every one of them understood their purpose, their part in the horrible drama that was about to unfold. Betsy pulled on her coat and eased herself out of the front door, closing it carefully behind her. The cold that met her pale cheeks was biting. Buckingham Street lay empty, the no ball game sign crooked and accusing. With a touch of stealth and a great deal of luck, she made her way across the grass in the direction of number 44, slipping into the ginnel that separated 46 and 47. There she convened with her friends, all of whom appeared to wear the same hesitant mask. "We sure about this?" Alice whispered. Betsy nodded and proceeded to tell her friends about the mysterious caller, the Quaker in the neat, dark suit. Edging into the back street, she glanced towards the rear yard of 44. All was quiet. The neighbouring houses were hushed too, as though in anticipation of some ghastly, impending event. "Come on, then," Alan said, pushing to the front of the group cockily and marching along the back street like a fearless infantryman. "It's all wrong," Betsy said, as the five of them stopped by the gate. I know what you mean," Brandon added, eyeing the dark windows. It was like an artificial face glared back at them, stiff and malevolent. Through the gate they went, returning to the scene of their earlier transgression. Once again, Alan tried the door handle. He didn't need to announce the fact that it was unlocked, as the slightest pressure saw the door creak open eerily. Alice sucked in a sharp breath. She's expecting us." "No," Betsy said. "No way. She just leaves things open." "Are we all up for this?" Alan said, his voice tinged with the hope that one of his friends would pull the plug. After all, he wasn't really sure what it was they were supposed to be up for. 4 nodding heads answered the ambiguous question. The group crossed the threshold. The kitchen was immaculate, just as it had been 2 days before. The walls were bare, the air unnaturally cool. If the bag lady had been coming and going these last 48 hours, there was no evidence of it. But there was a nasty smell in the air. Decay, sickly sweet. It permeated everything. But the kids refused to acknowledge it. A dark smear marked the edge of the skirting board, trailing towards a door at the inner end of the kitchen. The cellar door. Betsy approached it, emboldened by the silence of the place. It opened soundlessly, revealing an unappealing plunge into total darkness. "I'm not going down there," Rose said immediately. "I just can't." Alice took her hand. "It's okay," she said. "You can do this." "What are we doing exactly?" Rose blurted, trembling a little. Brandon put a hand on her shoulder. "I don't think we have a plan, do we?" he said, examining the wide-eyed faces surrounding him. "Not really," Betsy confirmed. "But if she's down there, we need to trap her somehow." "Trap her?" Alan burst out, frowning. "How?" "Something the Quaker man said," Betsy replied. "Something like, 'Fire burns its belly.'" "Huh?" Alice whispered. "What does that mean?" Betsy wasn't sure, but something told her that the thing, whatever it truly was that occupied the body of Cecelia Davenport, might be afraid of fire. It wasn't a case of burning 44 to the ground exactly, but perhaps a means by which to prevent the bag lady from leaving the cellar, assuming she was down there. "Anybody got a lighter?" she asked, looking instinctively towards Alan. But it was Rose who stepped forward. "Yeah," she said, pulling out a cheap-looking disposable thing. "Tim Sanderson sometimes asks for a light." "Tim Sanderson?" Alice piped up. "He's like 26. "No, he's not," Rose pleaded. "He's 13, if you must know." And then the pair seemed to remember where they were, the edge of darkness. Rose passed the lighter to Betsy, who, with some experience, rolled the wheel. Alan stepped forward, his face lit oddly by the flickering flame. "I'll go first." "No," Betsy said. "After me." She didn't wait for permission. The stairs were steep, functional. A faint glow pulsed somewhere below, weak and uneven. They reached the bottom. Even Rose made it. The stone walls hemming them in were streaked with grime and black smears. The floor was littered with scraps, plastic, fabric, bone. Bags hung from hooks hammered into the brickwork, their contents indistinct. At the center of the cellar lay a sight few had ever witnessed. A burrow fashioned from bin bags, cast-off clothing, insulation, nameless remnants, piled high and scooped out at the middle. The stench was overwhelming. Alan coughed involuntarily. "Jesus!" Brandon backed away, hand over his mouth. "This is wrong. This is really, really wrong." Betsy, however, stepped closer. The nest was warm. The thing radiated heat. She could feel it through the soles of her shoes, a faint vibration, like an animal breathing. The scraps around it told a story she didn't want to read. Feathers, fur, scraps of fabric that might once have been children's clothing. "It lives here," Alice whispered, trembling. "It grows here," Betsy corrected, and was about to take another step forward when a sound echoed somewhere above them, a heavy thump, followed by another, like monstrous, seeking footsteps. Rose screamed. She couldn't contain it. "She's back!" Brandon yelled. "Bran!" Betsy called, voice low. "Quiet! She'll—" Another thump. Closer now. Dragging, scraping, something massive and awkward moving across the floor. "Listen," Betsy went on, pulling her friends into a circle. "We've got to hide. Come on." And she dragged them towards a dark recess on the opposite side of the cellar, requiring an uncomfortable circumnavigation of the vile, rotten mound. Teeth chattered and bodies quivered, but the 5 children remained absolutely silent as the thing made its appearance at the top of the stone stairs. It was a dim shape to begin with, more shadow than form, a thing that seemed to float down the stony flight, its enormous bulk filling the entirety of the narrow passage like smoke caught in a matchbox. As the thing reached the cellar proper, all saw that little of Cecelia Davenport remained. It was more thing than person now. What greeted them was a round, bloated shape, all black bags and rubbish, with a small head attached to the top of it, identifiable by the plain mask it wore. The head, barely seen in the dim light, seemed to jerk from left to right, an unseen nose assessing the air. It proceeded towards the mound, squeezing its bulk into an aperture the size of a manhole. A succession of terrible sounds followed, the same wet, crunching sounds the children had heard on more than one occasion. And then it was gone, burrowed deep into its nest. Had it returned to rest, or had it returned to grow? Betsy and her friends internalized these questions as they cowered in the dark, damp recess that, for the time being at least, sheltered them from the bag lady. Part 12. The Gaping Maw. In the shadowy lair of Cecelia Davenport, 5 pairs of lungs tried to breathe without making sound. 5 sets of eyes refused to blink, as if blinking might attract attention. Betsy could hear the faintest drip of water somewhere within the walls. She could hear Rose's teeth clicking together uncontrollably. She didn't know how long they waited. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became something else. Alice's hand found Betsy's sleeve in the darkness and squeezed. Brandon's breathing came in soft, quick bursts, like an animal in a cage. Alan, for once in his life, had been completely stripped of bravado. And then Betsy felt it, the strangest sensation. The mound was still, the cellar dead, but something had shifted within the burrow. Something was aware. Betsy's stomach tightened. Its belly is never full. She pressed a palm to the cold stone wall to steady herself. There was a sound, something wet and slick forcing itself through something tight and smooth. Alice's eyes widened. She mouthed, "What do we do?" Betsy didn't answer, because she didn't know. The plan, such as it was, had been stitched together from fear and fragments. The Quaker's riddles, the lighter in Rose's pocket. Fire burns its belly. The mound shuddered. But this time it wasn't settling. It was rising. A seam of bin bags split open with a quiet tearing sound. Something moved, and the heat that had been radiating from it seemed to increase, as though the nest were a furnace being stoked from the inside. The stench intensified, worse than before, sweet rot, rancid waste. the faint metallic tang of blood. Rose heaved. She was close to throwing up. Betsy clamped her hand over her friend's mouth, felt tears wet her fingers. The mound opened, like a body bag unzipped from within. And then Cecelia Davenport emerged. A mass of black material and bulging sacks, the crude dress stretched to the point of indecency, stitches strained like ligaments. Its hands were swollen further, fingers thick, blunt, menacing. The pale mask that had once resembled a face was gone, revealing the horrifying visage beneath. A lump, a growth of some sort, sniffing with a nose that wasn't there, listening with ears that were entirely absent. And the lump began to expand, growing larger by the second, stretching, widening, with one essential feature, a great, gaping mouth, a wet black crescent revealing massive, shark-like teeth.
What?
It rumbled, the sound coming from somewhere other than the colossal cavern of daggers, a nightmare vibration delivered straight to the bones.
What's in the bag?
Brandon flinched so hard, his shoulder knocked the wall. The creature's head snapped towards the recess. Betsy's heart stopped. For a second, nothing happened. The creature stood there, enormous, swaying slightly. Then it moved. The floor trembled beneath its bulk. Bin bags rustled against each other. Something inside the dress shifted like a sack of live insects. Betsy's mind fired through possibilities in frantic flashes. Run, stairs, door, kitchen. But there was a major problem. The creature hovered between them and the stairs. Rose's eyes rolled back for a moment, as if she might faint. Alan's face was grey. Betsy felt her own fear trying to override her limbs, trying to press her down to the floor. She fought it the way her dad fought tiredness, by forcing himself to overcome it, climbing to his feet, doing what needed to be done. She leaned close to the others, lips near Alice's ear. "You have to run, all of you," she breathed. "I'll distract her. Go on, head for the stairs." Alice nodded, trembling. She was in no fit state to negotiate. She motioned towards the others, hinted at the stairs. When the time came, they would know what to do. Betsy waited for the creature to move again, an instinctive balancing act. Then she darted out into the open. The others darted too, surged out of the recess and sprinted for the stairs in a dense, stumbling cluster. Their shoes slapped stone. Their breath burst out of them. Someone, Rose, made a strangled sound that might have been a sob. The creature bellowed, its attention torn between the fleeing mass and the lone girl standing at what had once passed for its feet. But it thought for only a nanosecond. The massive body lunged after the stumbling cluster with surprising speed, hands slamming against the floor, dragging, hauling. Alan pushed Brandon. Brandon grabbed Rose. Alice clutched at the damp steps. Behind them, the thing closed in, a giant, vibrating mass of intent. Betsy saw with sudden cold clarity how easily the creature could pull them back down. "Hey!" she yelled, giving it everything she had. "It's me you want. Hey, I'm right here." And the bag lady stopped. Its huge, awkward frame ceased to move altogether. The fleeing kid stopped too, for, standing at the top of the cellar stairs, silhouetted against the faint light of the kitchen, was a man in a dark suit. Betsy recognized him instantly. The Quaker, clutching a small cloth bag, raised his head slightly and spoke. "Come," he said, his voice soft and steady. "Come," he repeated, as though addressing both the children on the stairs and the monster suspended in their midst.
What's in the bag?
The creature gurgled, a truly horrible sound to hear. The Quaker began to descend the stairs, repeating the word, "Come." Betsy expected him to pull the children past him, to steer them out, but he didn't. He passed them on the stairs, and all present saw the look of weary resignation on his face. The creature's cavernous mouth opened again, wider than ever. Betsy saw strings of saliva stretch and snap between teeth, saw the dark throat beyond. The Quaker came within striking distance of the thing. Slowly and somewhat clumsily, he extracted an object from the cloth bag. It was a curious item, a small, flame-coloured sphere. Betsy saw a large, glowing marble, but she knew it was something else entirely. It commanded her attention. "Come," the Quaker said again, and as he did so, he raised the sphere in front of him. The creature seemed to cower, recoiled slightly, as though in response to some distant memory, a half-forgotten recollection of danger. Then, without warning, the Quaker launched himself at Cecelia Davenport. For a moment it looked ridiculous, an old, exhausted man throwing himself at a monster twice his size. But the monster reeled backwards, bellowing, bloated hands flailing, trying to pry him and the strange object he held off. But the Quaker clung on like a leech, forcing the thing in the direction of the mound. The creature shrieked, an inhuman sound, muffled and distorted by the fact that something was attached to it. The cellar became a storm of rustling plastic, tearing fabric, cracking bone. The mound shuddered behind them, responding as though it were part of the thing's nervous system. Alice stared, paralyzed. Brandon shook his head violently, as if trying to shake the image loose from his mind. Betsy didn't have time to wonder. Both the Quaker and Cecelia Davenport were swallowed by the burrow, yanked inside like crumbs sucked into a vacuum cleaner. Alien sounds permeated the cellar, noises the 5 children could neither describe nor understand. The mound, burrow, or nest seemed to collapse in on itself, like a balloon popped with a needle. In the cavity left behind, Betsy saw an open void, stars littering a bottomless expanse. An object, in the shape of the thrashing bag lady, drifted towards the tiny pinpoints of light like a dead ship lost in space. The others joined Betsy, staring into the ether with wide, incredulous eyes. Rose whimpered. Tears streamed down Alan's face. It was both wondrous and monstrous, depending on whether one focused on the wider panorama or the hellish shape writhing at the center of it. Betsy thought of Market Street, thought of the poor woman being lifted like a doll, thought of the laundrette drums. Mindlessly, she eyed the remnants of rubbish strewn about the edges of the hole, pulled the lighter from her pocket, rolled the wheel, lit a sheet of yellow newspaper at her feet. And up it went, a basement bonfire, flames that consumed not only the fragments of remaining rubbish, but also the strange portal that had opened up before her. And a portal it had been, an exit from the ordinary world of Lowther, with its terraced houses and knobbly roadside trees, and a door onto something older, colder, and unimaginably distant. Whatever had worn the body of Cecelia Davenport had returned to its point of origin, a fact Stephen Carr would only piece together later, after weeks of uneasy reading and half-answered questions. He learned what he could from reluctant Quakers in forgotten meeting houses, men who spoke in fragments and euphemisms, and referred to the thing only as the material. It was not of this world. It had arrived long before humanity had learned to stand upright, and there were whispers, never confirmed, that it had nudged our species along its crooked path. It needed to return, again and again, to whatever distant place it called home, and the nauseous nests it built served as a means of passage. Imprisonment prevented its coming and going, spared mankind its insatiable alien hunger, a hunger that was intrinsic to its nature, that had intensified over the long centuries. But that was as far as Steve ever managed to go, ever wanted to go. He and his daughter were more than happy to wash their hands of the subject. Betsy and her friends stood in the glow of the blaze in Cecelia Davenport's cellar, watching as the flames devoured the portal like starving mouths. It was over in seconds. When the fire finally collapsed in on itself, all that remained was a shallow hollow, breathing out thin smoke and strewn with warm, grey ash. The bewildered children fled. They sprinted down the back street, launched themselves through the ginnel between 46 and 47, and dropped like stones onto the comfortable, if a little chilly, grass of Buckingham Street. Betsy's fingers closed around Rose's lighter in her pocket, the cheap disposable, the tiny wheel. 5 heads turned towards number 44, faces flushed in the winter dusk. From the outside, it was still absurdly neat, respectable, nothing to hint at the madness that had festered below its cool exterior. "What now?" Brandon managed, still panting. Alan and Rose stared at him, faces blank. Alice shrugged her shoulders. Betsy, though, her eyes a little brighter than the others, said, "We go home." She smiled as she said it. Relief immediately washed over the faces of her friends. "What a weird few days," Rose mumbled. Alan chuckled at that, but it was a surface laugh only. Deep down he was troubled. They all were. But there'd be time to process everything later, much later, when the grown-ups had done whatever was necessary to tidy up the loose ends, to put the kids' minds at ease, to make sure everything went back to normal. Later, in the quiet living room of number 22, Betsy sat beside her dad on the sofa. The house shook faintly with distant activity outside. The thrum of engines, shouted instructions, blue light flickering through the curtains. The authorities were busy out there, and yet Betsy wasn't in the least worried about any of it coming back to her. Steve's arm was around her shoulders. His face was grey, eyes fixed on nothing. Betsy told him everything. The plain truth, in the only order she could manage. The mound, the Quaker, the underground space, the cheap lighter. Steve listened to the whole tale. When she finished, he looked down at her. In the light of the television, she seemed smaller again, 9 years old, exhausted, a child whose primary concerns were supposed to be homework and playing out. She'd been through so much already, and here she was again, face to face with something beyond her comprehension. Betsy leaned into his side, eyes fixed on the curtain where the blue lights pulsed like distant lightning. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where dreams waited, Betsy wondered whether fire truly burned in the belly of the bodiless, or whether hunger, given time, would permit the bodiless to return.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.